What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today's video we're going to go over Apple's sign-in with Firebase and Flutter. So basically we're going to assume you already have the app set up and that you're already authenticating with Firebase, but now we're going to add in the ability to authenticate as well with Apple. So let me show you what that's going to look like real quick. Right here when you come to your sign in or sign up page, we're now going to have this sign in with Apple button. If you go ahead and click that, it's going to pop up with this and ask you, to sign in with Apple, and then you can give it your information here and hit continue. And you're going to have to give it your password when you're on a physical device, but if I type that in, you'll see now we are signed in with Apple, which is pretty cool. If you are trying to get just started with Firebase and Firebase Authentication, there's another video which I'll link below, and I actually have a playlist created with only the Firebase Authentication specific videos. This one I will add into there, but we do cover how to do it, how to sign in with Google and email with password and other videos, and also anonymous users. So let's get started with the Apple one though. All right, so I actually just recently upgraded my version of Flutter, and to do that, you go into the pubspec.yaml and you can just click the Flutter upgrade button here. This started to cause some problems with my pod file. I'm getting this warning down here, which is that the pod file is out of date. To fix that, I was able to, if you're having this problem and it's not actually building, I was able to go into my iOS folder over here and then find the pod file and the pod file lock and actually just delete them. And now this actually, if we delete them, we'll be able to regenerate them. So that's why we're going to delete them. But delete that, and before we regenerate it, meaning like before we rerun the app, just go ahead and we're going to update a few packages in our pubspec.yaml as well. And then we can rebuild it so it'll have those new dependencies as well. Firstly, we are going to update Firebase Auth. Right now I am on version 0.14.0. I have a whole nother video kind of talking about upgrading and how you can go through those steps, but right now this change that we're going to jump to is going to go to 15.3, which does not have any breaking changes from 14, so that should be fine. But if you're on a lower version, there might be things that you're going to have to change in the app itself. So check out that video. I'll link it right here. The next one, we're going to add two new packages as well. So the first one's going to be the Apple sign-in, and this is going to actually allow us to use Apple sign-in. And this version, we're going to just want 0.1.0. Which is the current version of that. And then we're also going to want another package called device information, or device info actually. And this is going to allow us to determine if we're on an iPhone or an Android phone. I think there's a few different ways you can do this, but we're going to be using this package. And this is the version I'll be using. So save that, then run the packages get, and if that runs okay, then you can actually go ahead and rebuild your project. And just by building it, actually, sorry, don't build it yet, stop that. And you actually want to go into the terminal, and you're going to want to build it for iOS specifically so that it will regenerate that pod file. You can see it already kind of started generating the pod file because I hit run there. So I'm just going to delete that again. And then I'm going to type in the command line, just flutter build iOS, and that should regenerate the pod files. This might take a bit of time, so I'm just going to pause it here. All right, so I ran the command, as I showed you, the flutter build iOS command, and it gave me an error, encountered error while building for device. So if you actually look up through this a little bit, you'll see it actually does do the Xcode build is said to be done. So actually what you need to do is open up your project in iOS, which you can do if you go on the iOS folder here and then go down to Flutter and then open iOS module in Xcode. You need to open it in Xcode and then run it here, and then this will actually get the app running right here in the simulator. So I'm going to stop it from Xcode now, And then if you go back to Android Studio, you should be able to run it, and this time it should work. All right, so now the app is running from Android Studio. Do note that I did have to run this about 3 times to get it to work, but I didn't actually change anything. I don't know if this is just my computer and it's being kind of slow, but I feel like there's like a timeout that happens and then it isn't actually running the app. So if you've done everything that I've gone over, which is deleting the pod file, running it from iOS or running it from Xcode, and then coming back in here and it still doesn't run, try running it at least 2 or 3 times, and then it should work. I've definitely spent a good bit of time just getting this part set up, so hopefully you don't run into this problem as much. But if you do, that's how I was able to solve it. All right, so now that we have the app running in Android Studio and we've added our new packages and actually upgraded Flutter, there is a configuration that we do need to make in Xcode itself, and that is to allow Apple sign-in. So to do that, you actually go to your project here and go to the runner, and then you're going to want to go to signing and capabilities, and then you're going to add a capability here. So click on this add capability, and then the one you're looking for is sign in. What is it called? Maybe Apple, sign in with Apple. There it is. So add this, and you'll see it tries to register all this. You're gonna hit try again there, and it might not work. Okay, this is not working. It could not be registered. All right, so if you're seeing this type of error as I'm seeing here, which is basically saying that this bundle identifier can't be used, which is very unfortunate because it should be able to be used, right? It's basically saying, like, I think this is a problem actually in Xcode and on Apple's end, and from doing a little bit of research, it seems the only way to solve this is to get to contact Apple and actually get them to like kind of fix it on their end. The workaround is to actually change your bundle identifier to something different, and if you do that, you'll see that this works now, right? Like the sign in with Apple works here. We're using a different bundle identifier, and that's all fine, but the problem with this is we have our app set up with Firebase using that original bundle identifier, so our app is no longer going to really work with Firebase. So I'm going to reconfigure that, and then I'll just show you the things I've changed. So let me do that real quick. All right, so go into your Firebase console, and where you have your app set up, you're gonna have 2 apps. The iOS app is what we're interested in, so click on that. And pretty much where you just need to change this bundle identifier here, but you'll see you can't actually edit this, so we're gonna need to add a new app, and it'll be iOS. And then we can put in our bundle identifier here, name it whatever. The App Store ID is optional, so we're not going to put that in right now. We're going to need to re-download this Google Services info.plist file. Hit next there. We have already done all of this, so we can just hit next there. And we've actually already done all of this as well. This isn't going to be able to find the project until we update that info.plist file, so let's just do that quickly. I just downloaded it, so back in our Android Studio here, under our iOS folder, and then under the runner here, and then you'll see we have our info.plist file. And really, if you look at this and then look at the one that I just downloaded, the only difference is probably going to be the bundle identifier, which is in here somewhere. But either way, we can just delete this one and delete. And then we can drag in our new one that we just downloaded into the runner here and hit OK. So then back in here, once that app gets running, this should be verified. So let's give that a second. All right, first, just trying to run it did not quite work. I think we might just need to delete the app from our actual simulator and then rebuild it completely from the beginning. So I just did that. You can delete the app just how you would delete any app, click it, and then delete app. And then just try running it again. All right, and now you can see finally that worked, and I was able to connect with my new bundle ID. So continue to console here, and you'll see now we have two iOS versions of the app. This first one we can just delete, so we don't need that anymore because we're not going to be using that old bundle ID anymore. Now, hopefully you didn't run into this problem and your old bundle ID just worked. And if that's the case, great. Mine, however, did not. I'm not exactly sure why, but if that does happen to you, that's the reason. So you can see back in Xcode, I just appended a 1 to this. I mean, it just needed to be different, unfortunately. But yeah, I have sign in with Apple configured here, and everything looks good from this end. So now we can actually continue on to our Flutter app and start making the updates for the actual sign in process. All right, so in our sign up view file down at the very bottom, we have a build social icons widget, which is actually what's building out this Google button. So let's go ahead and add another button there, which will be that Apple button. And with that package that we installed, which was the Apple sign-in package, it comes with a Apple sign-in button. So if you look, you have an Apple sign-in button right here, so you can use this, and it will just give you that Apple sign-in button styled to the Apple way of looking. So the on press now, you can just print out a message, and if you save this, you'll see the Apple sign-in button displays there. Now I would prefer the button to be black, so go ahead and add some, not that part, go ahead and add some style, which can be the button style.black should get you a black button. All right, so we want the Google button to be kind of the same size as the Apple button. I think we're just going to make them both larger, which will look nicer. Firstly, we can add this sized box of 10, because right now there actually isn't that much padding there. We can add this sized box of height 10 in between the buttons, so that looks good. And then actually in this column here, right before we call the children of the column, we can do the cross origin or the cross axis alignment, which is going to be pretty much what the whole width of this will be, and we want this to be stretched, so that's going to actually stretch the elements out. If you save that, now the buttons are essentially the same size. The Google one is a little bit narrower, but I think for now that's fine. So you'll note if you press this button, you'll see in our run over here that we are getting the button pressed, which we're just printing out from there. So that looks good. Now, instead of just printing this, we actually want to call the login function, which we have not set up yet, but we will set up in our provider. So let's go ahead and just name that. And this is going to be an asynchronous function because it'll be calling Firebase. So make this asynchronous. And then here we're going to, let's actually call await on this. And we're going to await we're going to use that auth variable from our provider, if you remember. So up here, the same thing that we're doing with the Google sign-in button, we use our auth provider, which is actually defined right here. So we're going to use our auth provider, and then we're going to actually call a new function, which we have not created, but it's going to be called sign in with Apple. All right, and then once we sign in with Apple, we're going to actually want to navigate to the home button, to the home page, which is the same thing that we do with Google. So you can copy that line exactly and just paste it here. So there you go. The one other thing that we're going to want to do before we go and create this sign in with Apple is notice that we have a try catch block, notice that not the try catch block, but actually this if else here. We are checking if the user is trying to convert from being an anonymous user to a permanent user, and that's because we actually use the same sign-in page view when we're doing that. Currently, we're not going to allow that to happen with Apple sign-in, meaning if you sign in as an anonymous user, you're not going to be able to convert your account to a permanent user with Apple sign-in. based on this video. So we are going to go ahead and wrap this whole thing in some logic that prevents you from converting. So actually we are going to want to extract all of this Apple button into its own widget of logic, and that way we'll have a little bit more control over if we're displaying it or not. So let's go ahead and build out the widget here, and we're just going to call it build Apple sign in. And this we're going to actually need to pass that auth parameter, because again, this auth variable is defined within this build social icons widget. So go ahead and pass that in here right now, and then copy all of this that we just coded up there, and actually, yeah, copy all of this, and then we're going to return it. We're going to return it here, and now we can just call this build sign in there with the auth. And at this point, nothing will have changed. It should look exactly the same. But what we can do is add the logic around this now and say if we are, if our auth form type, which basically we're going to be looking at this type of logic. So if our auth form type is of type convert, which just means that we're going to be converting from a anonymous user to a permanent user. If that's not true, which we can do with the exclamation equals, which means that if that's not true, if we're not on the type convert, and again, our auth form types are probably defined right up here. We have sign in, sign up, reset, anonymous, and convert. So the convert form type just means that we are converting. All the other ones are basically you're signing up as new. Really, these are the only two that you will get these views in, but other logic's already been set up to prevent that. So hopefully this kind of is making sense. And then if that isn't true, so that means we're not trying to convert from an anonymous user to a permanent user, we will display that Apple button. So you can save that, and since we aren't doing that here, you'll notice it looks the same. You'll notice this is kind of grayed out and has a little bit of a, it's not an error, more of a warning. If we want that to go away, we just need to return something else. We need to return another form of a widget. So basically what this is saying is the way it was written without the else is that we're not always guaranteed to return a widget from this function. So we can just return a container, or you could leave it how it was. I think either way will be fine. I think this is a little bit nicer though, because we'll just return an empty container instead of the button if this is not met. So another thing we will check eventually is that the user is on iOS 13. But for now, let's go ahead and build out this sign in with Apple function, which we do not have set up yet. So that's actually why my app crashed earlier, and that's why I'm rebuilding it now. So you're going to want to go into where you have your auth set up in the provider, which if you've been following along all of this, it should be set up as mine is in this services, auth services. So in here, this is where we're defining basically all of our Firebase authentication services and all the different types of stuff we can do with it. So you'll notice we have one for Google, which is the sign in with Google, and our sign in with Apple is going to be kind of similar. All right, so while I'm thinking about it real quick, go into Firebase and we need to allow the Apple authentication type. So go to authentication and then go to sign in method, and you're going to scroll down to the bottom and you should see, maybe refresh it, you should see that Apple is now a sign in provider on Firebase console. There it is, Apple right here. Instead of disabled, edit this to be enabled. And really right now we don't need to do any of this other stuff, but depending on if you are sending emails and other certain like URL callbacks, you might need to authenticate more there. But yeah, this will get us Apple sign in working, so make sure you do that or else this won't work. All right, so now we can actually write that sign in with Apple function. This is going to return a future, and it's not going to return anything specifically because it's just going to authenticate the user. So sign in with Apple is what we called it, and then This is actually going to be asynchronous because it's going to be making a call to both Apple and Firebase. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make our call to Apple and get our authorization result. So this is going to be using that new package that we installed, which is the sign in with Apple one. So this will be final, and then it's going to be we're going to get an authorization result, and this is going to await the actual Apple sign in, and then we're going to perform the request. So the request is going to be actually an array or a list, and the request here is going to be the Apple ID request. And then we need to give this the requested scopes, and the scopes that we want are the email and the full name. So it's going to be scope of email and scope of full name. So this is just telling Apple that we're requesting the user's email and their full name. And now once we have this, we can actually there's a few situations that we're going to get from this result. So potentially we'll get the authenticated user and it'll be successful, or we'll get a failure and the sign-in will have failed, or the user might cancel it. So those are the three scenarios we're going to go over right now. So let's go ahead and use a switch case here, so we can go through those three different types. So we're going to switch on the result status. So this is basically saying whatever, depending on what the status is, we're going to have a couple options of what that status could be. So that's where you use these case options. So the status could be, the authorization status could be authorized. And if that's true, we're going to do something. And when we're done doing it, we're going to actually break. That's breaking us out of the switch statement. Now we can kind of copy this 3 more times, because we're going to have those 3 statuses, right? So the second one is going to be if we have an error. And the third one is going to be if the user canceled. So pretty much if these 2 last ones happen, it means something went wrong. Or not necessarily wrong, it just means, like, the error does mean something went wrong. So we can handle that in different ways, but we're really just going to print right now. We're going to print out that the sign-in failed. And then we can give it actually the error. So to give it the error, this is kind of more just for debugging. Later you can kind of do, you can handle this differently and show it to the user, but we're not going to cover that. So this is the result error. You get the localized description, and this will kind of just tell you what the error was. If the user canceled, this isn't actually an error. This just means they tapped out of the screen before it was completed. So this, we can just say user canceled. All right, now the one that we're mostly interested in is when the user is actually authorized. So again, we make this result request to Apple, asking to authorize them and give us the email and the full name. And then down here, we're saying, okay, Apple gave us back the authorization, and we have this result now. So we can use this result to actually create a Firebase user now with this credential. And then once we have the Firebase user, we can, return that from our sign in with Apple, and then our Apple know that they're signed in. All right, so there's a few variables now that we need to get from our result. So first, let's get the actual credential from our result. So this is going to be actually a Apple ID credential, and we can just call this the credential. And that's going to actually, let's not call this the credential, because we're going to call our Firebase credential the credential. Let's call this our auth. So this is the auth this is our Apple ID credential. So it's a result of credential. So again, that's this result right here. And then that's good. We're also going to need an OAuth provider now. So the OAuth provider is now something that we're going to be using from Firebase, which instead of using this Google Auth provider, we're just going to use a generic OAuth provider. So let's go ahead and configure that, or define that rather. So it's going to be an OAuth provider, and we're going to just call it the OAuth provider. And then that's going to be the new OAuth provider. And we can give it a provider ID. So this provider ID is actually important because we need this to be apple.com. So Apple ID is our provider, which is kind of just setting this up how the Google Auth provider gets it kind of automatically because it's more baked into Firebase. But now this auth provider is basically our Apple auth provider. And then now we can actually get we can use this OAuth provider to get our credential from Firebase itself. So similar up here, how we're getting this credential from Firebase by giving it an ID and access token, we're going to do the same thing. And we're just going to be using this OAuth provider and also using this Apple ID credential. So to do this, it's very similar. It'll be a final, and we're going to actually save this as the credential. And this will be an auth credential, which is a Firebase auth credential. And this, we're going to now use that OAuth provider, and we're going to call get credential on it. And then you can see it's already defaulting, asking for the ID token, and it's going to want actually the ID token as well as an access token. So let's go ahead and set that up. And we actually have both of these variables as part of this auth credential. So we can call the auth credential, which is just called auth, and we can call the ID token, which is actually a little bit more written out as the identity token, but same thing. And then same down here with our access token, we can do the auth of the access. Yeah, we can do the ID of the access token, which is actually going to be the authorization code. So this is just a difference between how Firebase calls them and how they're called from Apple, but they are the same thing. You notice we're getting an error here, and that is because the format of this identity token as well as this authorization code, and we don't need that there. The format of this does not match the format that Firebase needs these credential variables to be in. Firebase needs them as a string, and right now they are these. If you hover over the actual error, you'll see that these are uint8 list types, and the ID token needs to be a string. So we can actually convert this pretty simply with built-in feature of Firebase, or not Firebase, rather Flutter and Dart. And we're just going to we're going to call string, and then we're going to call from char codes. Not from char code, you want the one with from char codes. And this is basically going to allow us to convert that uint8 list to be a actual string. So just call this on both of these variables, and you'll see our errors should go away. All right, so our problem is actually just a typo right here. The access token needs to have a colon there. And then you'll see everything, the errors go away and everything looks fine. So at this point now we have our credential, which is actually a Firebase auth credential. And we can now use this credential to actually sign in with Firebase. So we still haven't actually created the user account for Firebase yet, which is what we're going to do on this line right here. So we're just going to await, and we're going to use our Firebase auth, which we have defined at the very top of the page here, Firebase auth instance. So we're going to use our Firebase auth instance, and we're going to call sign in with credential. So we're going to be signing in with a Firebase auth credential, and then we already have our credential defined here. So that will get us signed in. So at this point, if you were to run it, everything should work and you'll be able to sign in, but there's one last piece that we're going to do, and that's going to be updating the user information. So the reason we need to do this is because we're not actually, just by calling this here, we're not actually going to be saving the user's name, the user's full name. We're only just going to be getting a new user with that email address that we get from Apple. So to update their name, we can use our Firebase Auth instance, and then we can call the current user, which is the user that was just signed in here. And then we can do pretty much on this value, there's going to be a value here. And we can use that value, V-A-L-U-E, we can use this value in an async call. We're going to get the user's information. So we need, it's actually going to be of type of user update info. So user update info right here, and we can just call this the user. And then we're going to get the user's update information. And then we can use that information and call the display name, and we're going to just set that equal to, and it's going to be a string value. We're going to set it equal to the auth variable. We need that $sign here for the string interpolation. It's going to be that auth variable, and then it's going to be the full name, and it's going to be, the full name is actually split into the given name and the family name. So we're going to do it for the given name, and then we're going to add a space and do the same thing for the family name. So it's just going to be the user's first and last name. Then we could end that there. Then the last thing is just to actually update this with this value with this information. So this will be another call. So it would be an await, and we're going to do the value, and we're going to call update profile on it. And then we're going to actually pass it that user's information. So there's that. There is potential now that this user isn't going to have an auth full name. So we can actually just wrap this whole thing in an if statement. And we can say if the user auth full name is not equal to null, then we're going to call this and update it with that name. All right, that should be good, and that should save our user's name in Firebase now. And we're actually not in the app currently using the user's name, but at some point we'll probably build out a profile, and it'll be nice to show the user's name, or say like a hello welcome message, something like that. But now if we save this, and since we already are calling this sign in with Apple function back in our Apple sign in button, and we're already navigating to the home page, we should be able to simply sign in with Apple, and it should work. So if we could click sign in here with Apple, all right, it's saying the auth service doesn't have this method. Okay, it's actually a typo. This should be sign in. I spelled that wrong. Sign in with Apple, and then in our auth service it is spelled correctly. So that is the reason for that. You can run it again anyway, and now if you click sign in and then click sign in with Apple, you'll see this nice thing pops up. You could hit continue here, and now it's going to ask you if you want to sign in with the account that you're signed in with. So this phone is signed in with my my Gmail. So if I'll click that, you'll see it asks, I guess, which email you want to use. You can continue with your password. Then it's going to ask you to type in your password for actually your Apple ID. If you were doing this on your actual device and it had the fingerprint or Face ID, it would just use that instead. But here I'll type in my password. All right, and then I'll hit continue. And it's going to actually probably do, it's going to do the two-step verification here. So you're going to need it. And again, this is really only because I'm on my computer. If you were doing this on your actual phone, it should just work. But yeah, I'll type in this code. And then you'll see it loaded us up. We're on the home page because we had that navigation line here happening after the sign in. And then if you go into the Firebase console and go to our authenticated users, you'll see my Gmail account, which was the one that I just signed in with, and my provider was Apple. So yeah, that is all looking good, and Apple sign-in is now configured on our app, which is very cool. Another thing I can show you real quick is the reason we added this if statement earlier is because we don't want users to be able to convert from an anonymous user to the Apple sign-in user. And I believe we don't even hide this page if you're not an anonymous user. So if you click on this profile button here, you'll see we don't have that Apple sign in button there. If you were actually to not have this if statement, or rather instead, if we just made this if statement equal here, you'll see the Apple sign in button is there. So we don't, I hope I'm kind of explaining this correctly. Like, this page shouldn't even show up if you're signed in as a non-anonymous user, but that's something we're not hiding right now. But we're not going to allow users to convert to an Apple user if they already were signed in as an anonymous user. But that's something you could potentially set up yourself. Now, another thing we want to do is, we can cancel out of this, is we don't want to allow this Apple sign-in to happen if you're on a device that is not an iOS device and that is not iOS 13 or above. And the reason for this is actually because this Flutter package doesn't support signing in from other devices that are lower, or an iOS device that's lower than iOS 13. So that's something that hopefully will be supported later, but that is not going to work currently. So to do that, we can actually create another quick little function that's going to check what our user's OS is. And since we're in the sign up view, and this is really the only page we're ever going to show that sign up button, we can do all of this logic right in here. So firstly, we're going to create a new variable, and this is going to be right after the sign up view state. So yeah, we can do it right after that. And this is just going to be a bool value, which means it's either going to be true or false. And we're going to call it show Apple sign in. And this we're going to set to false by default. So this being false, we can now use this value down here, and in our if statement where we're deciding if we should show the button or not, we can just say if this value that we just created, in addition to that, so we're going to want to use an and here. So if this value sign in with Apple, or the show Apple sign in, equals true, then we want to show the Apple sign in. So as of now, it's always going to be false. If we log out and go to sign in, you'll see the Apple button is no longer there. So now we just need to add a little bit of logic to decide if we should show that button based on the user's OS type. So scroll all the way back up, and this actually is where we're going to start using that package we imported, device info, back in the beginning of the video. So back in our sign up view though, we're going to do two things. We're going to first create a function. We can create this function right here, actually in the state class, right after the bool that we just made. Go ahead and create a function that's called use Apple sign in. And this is going to be an asynchronous function. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say if the platform is iOS, and this platform is from that package. So we actually need to import that new package, which is, so import that device info package here, and now you'll see platform will, okay, we need, in addition to this, we also need to include another package, which is just a Flutter package, and it's just the Dart.io. This will actually get us the platform, or give us access to the platform. So now we can check if the platform is iOS, and then if that platform is iOS, we want to check the version, which is what we can actually use the device info package for. So once we're in here, if it was iOS, we are now going to get the device information. So let's just set it to a variable called device info. And this is why it's asynchronous, because we're going to make this call that's to device info plugin, and then we're going to do iOS information, because we already know we have an iOS device because of this if statement. So then we can get the version of that, and we'll save that to another variable, and this will just be the version of the user's device. So we can call that device info variable we just set and do the system version. All right, and now we want to make sure that system version, which is actually going to come back as a string variable. If you you can print it out if you want to see that, but we want to check if that device version is greater than 13. So we're going to actually need to convert the string version to a double. So use double.parse, and then we can give it that version. And then we want to check if that version is greater than or equal to 13, because I'm assuming that any version higher than 13, 14, 15, you know, all those will be supported by this. And then we can just set the state. If that is true, that means we're on iOS 13 or greater. We can set the state for that show Apple sign-in to equal true. All right, so this right now is not being called anywhere. So we need to call this, pretty much we want to call this when we go originally to this page. So to do that, we can add actually an init state for this variable. So we're overriding the init state, and we're going to just call this function, which is going to override this variable potentially. It might not override it if it doesn't need to be overridden, and in that case, it will just, the state will just be false, which is what it defaults to. So if we save this, and we're going to need to rerun this because this state was already initialized as being false. But if you rerun it and then click sign in, it will run this function, and then it sets that to true. So yeah, this looks great now. Now we should only be allowing sign in with Apple on iOS 13 or greater, and yeah, it's working with Firebase, which is great. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel, and that's going to be it for today. Ciao for now.